This is the
Five Starr
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. This is such good shit.
What do you guys want to talk about?
Do you remember on last week's show where we reviewed the 1994 Royal Rumble? And I talked about how easy it was to watch because the thing was only about 2 hours and some change. Kind of talked about how I missed the days when pay-per-views actually ran reasonable lengths of time and didn't overstay their welcome. Well, guess what the cock ran this past weekend? The annual Royal Rumble event. The 2023 Royal Rumble, to be more specific. And because I'm on YouTube, I'm going to try to hold off on the incessant cursing until we're a little ways into the podcast. But when you round out everything with the pre-show material, we were basically looking at about a 6-hour show from beginning to end. I guess 7 if you want to count the press conference they hosted afterwards. Because even WWE's team apparently doesn't believe in the benefit of sleep. Seriously. 4+ hours of main card material. And for what, you ask? Well, I'll tell you. Basically for 2 things. Cody winning the Rumble match, and everything that transpired after the main event. The first of which happened in the first hour or so when my brain was at least semi-functioning. And while we'll definitely talk about the angle they did after the Universal title match with the Bloodline, when you factor in the turd sandwich they fed us in the middle there, basically for 3.5 of those 4 hours, my God, was it even worth it in the end? I'm still contemplating that to this day. I've had a while to simmer on this thing, and I'm honestly not even sure how to really collect my thoughts after it. By the time they shot that angle at the end of the show, the only thing I could think was, wouldn't it have been great if that same thing wasn't happening at the butt crack of dawn? And by that I mean well past midnight. God. All right, I'm just going to come out and say this right now. We're going to talk about the Royal Rumble in a few minutes, but I just need to get something off my chest because, warning here, spoiler alert, I'll throw this out at the beginning of the podcast. There are going to be several tirades that I plan on going on during this thing. I have officially determined at this point, with the way modern pay-per-views are run in wrestling, there's just no feasible way for me to enjoy these anymore. Even when they do shoot great angles like they did at the end of this show, by the time they wind up doing stuff like that, it comes at the expense of totally screwing up my sleep schedule because every single one of these stupid events has to go on and on and on and on and on forever. Seriously, help me out here. I need to know. How are you supposed to enjoy watching things when they go on for this long? Even the most loyal, die-hard mark that does nothing but consume this content has to throw up the white flag at some point. I'm telling you, man, as long as companies like AEW or WWE insist on running these 6+ hour shows like this, I'm just going to accept the fact that I'll probably wind up hating it by the end. Especially when they produce shows like this. Never-ending premium live events that basically eat up your entire evening and part of your nighttime routine. And again, for what, you ask? A men's Rumble match that wasn't even good until the last few minutes. One of the greatest atrocities of a match I've seen perpetrated in a long time. A throwaway, pointless girls' title match that no one gave a crap about. On top of a girls' Rumble match, which got plenty to say about that. I'll get into that later on, because that thing stunk to high heaven. As it does every year they run it. And unfortunately, by the time we got to the main event with Roman and Owens, I was so over this show, they never even really had a fair shot at winning me over. It just wasn't going to happen. The only thing that stopped this from being one of the worst shows I've seen in a long time was the last 10 minutes before they cut the live feed. Had it not been for the post-match deal, not even kidding, I might have outright canceled the network subscription. Just saying, I'm done. I can't take it. Everything about modern wrestling is just so bad at this point. No joke, I would have ended it right there. And of course, I realized shortly thereafter, I'm like, wait a minute, then that means we can't review the classic content, and this channel would be completely worthless at that point. Not to say it's breaking down any barriers at the current moment, but we made at least a little bit of progress over the last year and a half. I consider gaining views and garnering attention as a good thing for the small publicity this channel actually gets on YouTube at this point. I'll take what I can get. And I still enjoy doing this as a side hobby, but man, oh man. WWE was really testing my patience with this blot. This ongoing, never-ending 2023 Royal Rumble that still might be going on as of this morning. I'm not convinced it's over as we speak. My sleep schedule's so out of whack, I can't even tell anymore. I don't know what's up, what's down, what's sideways, whatever day of the week it is. I think it's Sunday. I know I'm putting this thing off as long as I can. What you would probably call delaying the inevitable. Normally this would be the part in the show where I do the channel plugs, but since I already know this one's going to run long to begin with, much like this damn pay-per-view did, we should probably get this thing rolling, because there is a lot to say. I contemplated how I even wanted to open up talking about this thing. I already kind of touched on rant number 1, and that's primarily what's been eating away at me for the past 24 hours. Just the mere fact that I can't stand the way wrestling pay-per-views are run anymore. And again, circling back to the 94 Royal Rumble we talked about last week. Here's the thing. Yes, the poor quality of a show can hinder your viewing experience, and admittedly so. When we did the retro review on the 94 Rumble pay-per-view last week, overall, I said it wasn't a great show. I think I even said it's probably not one that you would go out of your way to check out again in your spare time. But I did say it was an easy watch. I said it was easy to digest. And when I look back at things, even if the 2023 Royal Rumble had better ring work or had higher quality matches, relatively speaking, although that's up for debate, it's not even up for question with me. In a heartbeat, I would rather rewatch the 1994 Royal Rumble again before ever watching the 2023 Rumble. I don't care how good the in-ring product is or how star-spangled awesome the moves or spots are. It really boils down to this. If you ask me to sit through a pretty dull, lackluster 2.5 hour pay-per-view versus a slightly more memorable, somewhat better 4+ hour pay-per-view, I don't give a damn what memorable moments are being created in that window. Ain't no way on God's green earth I'm carving out 4+ hours of my day to rewatch some cool spots. I'm taking the lackluster 2.5 hour pay-per-view any day of the week. I can reasonably set aside a few hours in my day to watch wrestling, even if I can't do it every day. 4, 5, 6 hours. At this point, it's like, no, fuck you. I'll catch the replay. Or I'll watch the thing in snippets. I'm just too old for this shit, man. I work 3 jobs. I actually value getting 6, 7, or 8 hours of sleep depending on how early I wake up in the morning. This whole 4+ hour slog, the whole way they've set this up through the streaming service, it's ridiculous at this point. I don't know how anybody can handle it. And I know for a fact I'm not alone with that assertion. But with that main tirade out of the way, let's actually get into the card. We began this catastrophic fiasco with the Men's Rumble match, which already spawned bad news right off the bat because it basically inferred that the Girls' Rumble match was either going to be in the main event or at the very least a semi-main. Ended up being the latter. I mean, by the time that actually happened, I already mentally checked out of the show anyway. By the way, I should point out for those unaware, the show was live from the Alamo Dome in San Antonio, Texas. Probably would have led you to guess that if there was ever somebody that was bound to make a special guest appearance in the Rumble match, it was Shawn. I mean, the guy was literally just on Raw's 30th anniversary show doing jag-off comedy with all his fellow DX comrades. But no, we didn't get Shawn. We did, however, get an hour-long snooze fest with the Men's Rumble match. And I'm going to start off by saying, I watched the whole thing from start to finish. At the time it started, I was still in the middle of eating dinner, so I wasn't actively taking notes while the first part of it was going on. What I did instead was I watched the thing unfold in front of me while I was eating. I was going to try to retain as much information as I possibly could so that when it was over, I could go back into my notes and type up a couple things and try to recall as much of the match as I could. What I would consider the key notable takeaways. Spoiler, there weren't a whole lot. And I think watching this play out really kind of put into perspective the reality of where we are with these Rumble matches in 2023. Remember back in the day when you'd get these Rumble matches every year and all the big, larger-than-life stars were a part of it? They didn't clutter up the ring with a bunch of underneath schlubs or comedy characters. Remember when these events actually felt like big deals? Because you could viably envision several scenarios in your head of main event guys that could actually win the thing? I'm sitting there watching this thing from the beginning. You know, it actually starts off looking kind of promising with the first 2 guys that come out here. I'm like, all right, it's Gunther and Sheamus. Albeit not the biggest fan of Sheamus at this point, but, you know, these two have had some good chemistry together at one point. It has the vibe of 2 big stars clashing here to open things up. Hopefully, as the ring fills up with more guys, you know, the quality of the match will continue to rise as we move along in this thing. And then come the layered entrances. And as God is my witness, it's geek after geek after geek after geek after geek. Miz is out there early on. The fucking New Day's out there early on. Johnny Gargano's out there early on. I mean, sorry to say, but Jim Cornette has officially ruined Johnny Gargano for me. I was never the hugest fan of his in NXT, but the more I listen to Cornette's takes of his, the more I start to realize, yeah, you know what? He's kind of right about the guy. he was a very early internet darling at one point when he was doing all the stuff with Tommaso Ciampa. And then the more I saw of him, the more I realized there's nothing all that special or unique about this guy at all. I mean, he was the flavor of the month right up until the point people got bored of him and moved on to their next toy. So even when he came out for this thing, I just kind of farted at it, as did most of the crowd. Kofi and Xavier, of course, had to do their stupid slapstick comedy spots, including one of the gayest things I think I've ever seen in a wrestling ring, where Xavier was holding Kofi upside down under his legs so that he could spank his ass. And if you think I'm exaggerating that in the slightest, go watch it for yourself. It was pretty much one step away from a glorified porno scene. In the middle of a match that's supposed to decide the fate of their WrestleMania main event for the most prestigious championship. And these two are out there tapping each other's asses. God, I hate wrestling. And again, like I talked about, the ring is cluttering up with more guys, and the only thing I keep asking myself the whole time is, why would anybody reasonably think any of these guys could win? Remember when the whole gimmick of the Rumble match was to involve main event top stars that people actually bought as main eventers or believable title contenders? Who in their right mind would ever suspend their disbelief for a second that dorks like Johnny Gargano could win the Royal Rumble? Or The Miz? Or fucking Kofi Kingston and Xavier Woods? So stupid. So things are kind of chugging along for a while. I'm still impatiently waiting for some kind of star to actually get involved at some point. And right on cue, who should come out at number 12 but Brock Lesnar, directly coming after a spot where Kofi ate shit on the floor after getting knocked into one of the announcers' chairs. I think they were going for another one of those bullshit Kofi Rumble moments where he gets thrown out of the ring, but because he somehow miraculously lands without touching both feet on the floor, they play it up like he's not eliminated. Well, here in this case, Michael Cole is talking about how technically when Kofi went ass over tea kettle onto this chair, only one of his feet hit the floor. So that would stand to reason that he's not eliminated. So we wait a little while, and Kofi never came back. He was just gone and never spoken of again. So what happened? Was he eliminated? Was he not? No one knows. They just took the attention off of it and never acknowledged it for the remainder of the show. I presume Kofi was eliminated. I guess we'll find out on Raw when they play up Kofi's new gimmick over the next 12 months as him trying to claim to be the real winner of the 2023 Royal Rumble. And he comes out to protest Cody getting the title shot. I mean, if there's ever a good way to turn Kofi heel, that'd be the way to do it. But getting back to the Brock thing for a minute. I've talked about this before. I've personally been over the whole Brock Lesnar thing in WWE for a long time now. You see one Brock match at this point, you pretty much see it all. I mean, the guy does nothing but German suplexes and F5s, and his matches are usually the shits anyway. And I know the guy's a big star for them, and the people always pop for the entrance, but at this point, I don't even know why they're bothering with him. And he's not getting them any return on their investment. He's been overexposed for the better part of 10 or 11 years now. What I'm still trying to figure out based on everything they did here, A, why'd they even have the guy come out if he was only going to wind up getting eliminated by Bobby Lashley in like 3 minutes? But more importantly, B, can someone explain to me why Brock still has beef with Lashley? Correct me if I'm wrong. I know I'm old, but I mean, I at least retain information from things that happened 4 months ago. Didn't Lesnar beat this guy at Crown Jewel clean as a sheet? Granted, I guess they're still tied at one apiece in their feud because, Lashley beat Lesnar at last year's Rumble. So I guess they're teasing the idea of some kind of rubber match at some point. I mean, based on the crowd reaction, it doesn't really seem like anything people want to see. I personally think there's more money to be had in a Lesnar-Gunther program than there is a Lesnar-Lashley rematch. The stare down Lesnar and Gunther had here got a pretty big ovation. Whereas when Lashley eliminated Lesnar like a minute later, the people shat all over it. Which kind of tells me that the WWE fans don't really seem to be digging Lashley right now. Which you can mainly fault their creative team for because, I remember Lashley was red hot with the crowd at one point. Now he's colder than a witch's tit because of how poorly they've done with his booking. But, seriously, up to this point, Lesnar was the biggest name in this thing. And he just gets unceremoniously dumped out of the ring in like 3 minutes like the biggest piece of shit on the planet. Why bother? Really? By far, Pat McAfee had the line of the night during this match where he actually said the words, and I kid you not, he referred to it as the cock. And upon immediately realizing that he fucked up by saying cock on live broadcast, he tried to immediately backpedal it by calling it peacock. As if there was any way that course correction was going to amount to anything at that point. I laughed so hard. It was almost as great as Michael Cole calling Dominic a piece of shit a little later on. And again, yes, whether or not it was an inadvertent slip of the tongue, he did actually say the word shit out loud. I think he tried to cover up for it, but no, I heard it. Plain as day. I also didn't mention at the top of the report, but McAfee was one of the first guys out here at the top of the show. And while Cole was having an orgasm at the commentary desk over it, Corey Graves was being obnoxious and trying to bury the whole thing. At which point I just wrote down, Corey Graves is fucking rotten. Some people like Graves, whatever. I always thought he sucked. Sucked as a wrestler, and he sucks even more as a commentator. And I don't care about the whole guaranteed employment thing. I get it. The dude had to retire early because of the concussion thing. All right. Yeah, it sucks. But, at the same time, that doesn't mean I have to sit here and pretend the guy's a good ring announcer because he's horrible at his job. Just awful. Now, I mentioned the Dom thing a minute ago, so I should probably note the other semi-redeeming quality about this match before the main event, or before the closing minutes of it, I should say. But Rey Mysterio was supposed to be the 18th entrant, but he never came out. And oddly enough, conveniently enough, who should come out at number 19 but Dominic? And he comes out wearing Rey's mask. He's just being a total smarmy douchebag all the way down the aisleway. Which, by the way, this is a long entryway from Gorilla. Even with dudes running out, it still took him almost a full 45 seconds to actually clear the aisleway to get into the ring. It was indeed a trudge. So, well, we never found out what happened to Rey either. Figuring that there's always cameramen hanging out backstage, I would have presumed that somebody would have seen him, but apparently not. And I will admit that things picked up for a little bit here once Dom got involved. Leave it to Dominic Mysterio to save the 2023 Royal Rumble, right? I love the I'm Your Mommy t-shirt he was sporting. Another slimeball tribute to Eddie, but it also plays in the stuff he's been doing with Rhea on television. And once Dom actually came out, when Finn Balor and Damian Priest join in, they were able to kind of work together and incorporate some storyline stuff with the Judgment Day. One of the other surprise entrants for this was Booker T, who I believe came in at either number 20 or 21. it's par for the course. We get at least 1 or 2 legends making special appearances for these Rumble matches, so it was fine. He got to go in there and break out some of the classic moves, including the signature Spinneroonie, and boy howdy, you want to talk about Booker seeing some better days. That looked like a struggle for him to execute that thing. He's not as flexible as he once was. And of course, he gets dumped like a minute later by Gunther, so thanks for coming, Book. But, things are sort of trickling along still. Judgment Day's out there trying to do the gang beatdown on everyone. And of course, as soon as Edge comes out at 24, the people started going ballistic again. Fuck, he got a bigger pop than Booker T. I guess the last thing Edge was involved with was the deal they shot last year when him and Balor had that I Quit match, and the Judgment Day basically put Edge and Beth Phoenix in an iron lung for the better part of 4 months. If you ask me to recall what the hell they did off the top of my head, I'm out to lunch, dude. I couldn't tell you. But this was technically Edge's big return. And what a return it was. He came down and ran roughshod over the entire Judgment Day crew. Threw out Damian, threw out Balor. He almost threw out Dom, but he managed to scramble his way back into the ring. By this point, we had at least a few more notable names. Got Drew McIntyre in there, Bobby Lashley, like I mentioned a while ago. Seth freaking Rollins was in there. So, to be fair, it wasn't all cluttered with mid-card geeks, but it took a while to actually get to the main event stars. Logan Paul was a pleasant surprise when he came in at 29. People went nuts for that. Logan actually hit a buckshot lariat on Ricochet at one point. Looked better than Adam Page's. Speaking of those two, on top of the Pat McAfee saying the word cock, by far, my favorite moment of this entire show was the collision spot with Ricochet and Logan Paul. The last time I laughed this hard at a spot was probably last year at WrestleMania when Vince botched taking the stunner. The springboard collision thing that Ricochet and Logan did, it was the funniest fucking thing I've seen in forever. Most notably because the spot was so ludicrous on its face, but because they actually executed it so perfectly, I started howling to the top of my lungs. I probably woke the neighbors up with how hard I was laughing. I mean, they showed like 3 or 4 replays from various angles. They needed to show like 18. Literally, all they did was scream at each other from opposite ends of the ring and said, "All right, motherfucker, you want to go? You want to go?" And I guess the reason it's so hysterical is that I guess I was expecting them to just get in the ring and start throwing some goofy-looking windmill punches or something. But when they both leapt onto the ropes and did simultaneous springboard leaps into each other from like 15 to 20 feet apart, and they just collided with one another and made this huge thud noise, I just broke down. I started laughing uproariously. Mostly I was wondering, so what the fuck was their game plan exactly? They just said, all right, we're going to springboard into each other as hard as we can. They actually came up with that spot. Oh my God. Highlight of the show by far. Well, not really, but definitely a Royal Rumble moment for the ages. People will be talking about that in years to come. More so than Kofi botching whatever he was supposed to do in this match. But of course, we get down to the final entrant. And, they already kind of spoiled that Cody Rhodes was making his comeback here, so it wasn't necessarily a big surprise return as much as it was just a breath of fresh air to actually see the guy back for the first time in well over 8 months. And he came out here and got the whole pomp and circumstance entrance with the fanfare music, the smoke machine playing. I mean, they even set off pyro and fireworks for the guy. Really tried to play it up as a huge deal. And again, even with people kind of already knowing he was going to show up here, it didn't hinder the reaction he got. They all went crazy for him. And he looked in great shape, too. Obviously, once he got in the ring and they were doing close-ups on him, you could see the scar tissue from where they did surgery on him. But he went in there and didn't hold back. He hit all his signature spots. Everyone fed for him. He actually tossed Brawny the Strowman out, which got a pretty big pop as well. And, once they got Theory out of there, it boiled down to the final four of Cody, Gunther, Seth, and Logan Paul, who at that point was either sleeping on the floor or trying to keep himself obstructed from the camera. And, the little interaction with Cody and Seth was good. Those two obviously had history dating back to last year. I like the sequence they did with Gunther where they both hit him with simultaneous pedigrees. People really dug that spot. It was weird seeing Seth get dumped out by Logan Paul, of all people. I would have thought they would have saved that for Cody since they already established that he had Seth's number from beating him 3 straight times last year. But they gave the elimination spot to Logan, who ended up almost getting immediately eliminated by Cody anyway. And this was actually a pretty cool thing they did at the end, where the last 2 guys ended up being the first and final entrant for the Rumble match. And I could not have paired a better final 2 guys if I tried. Cody and Gunther as the last remaining guys was absolutely perfect. You had the right sympathetic babyface getting paired with one of their secondary top heels on the SmackDown brand. Both guys are perfectly matched together. And they were able to tie a nice little bow around this thing by the end. While they didn't give too much away, when you saw those guys going at it in there, you could think to yourself, man, isn't this a match made in heaven? Watching Gunther in there chop and work over Cody's injury, Cody selling and fighting from underneath, the teasing of those elimination spots at the end where he's hanging on for dear life, you could really feel that pulling at people's heartstrings. Anytime Cody took a bump or got slapped in that bad pec region, it makes you really get behind Cody that much more. There was a lot of drama they were milking at the end of this thing, and hats off to these guys. And they had a great finish where Cody finally hits Gunther with the crossroads, and he's rallying the people behind him because he's setting up Gunther near the ropes, and he charges full speed, gives Gunther that big clothesline. Gunther takes a great bump over the top rope to the floor. And Cody survives the big evil foreigner. His return to WWE is a triumphant one. The winner of the 2023 Royal Rumble match. Which again, I don't think is surprising for a lot of people in the grand scheme of things. Pretty much everybody and their dead grandma was calling that the moment they caught wind that Cody was returning here. And, while this sets up Cody for a guaranteed world title match at WrestleMania, it does call into question how they go about constructing that, considering it is a 2-night event. As we'll see later on, the Bloodline's going to have some story material to wrap up at Mania as well. So it'll be interesting to see if Cody or Roman end up pulling double duty on that show. I mentioned how in a case like that, you can make the argument for doing the co-Royal Rumble winner again like they did in 94 with Luger and Brett. At least in that way you can set up a championship match on both night 1 and night 2. An example being the idea of doing Sami versus Roman for the title on night 1 and then doing Cody versus Roman the following night. Or vice versa, I guess. But, they wound up going with the standard finish of having Cody get the win here, and that works too. And this is going to now lead into some follow-up questions people are going to have in the build-up to the WrestleMania card. Should or shouldn't Cody be the one to beat Roman for the title? It's an interesting conversation to have, and one that I think deserves more attention at a later time when we actually draw closer to the show. Obviously with Cody just coming back from the injury, they're going to need to spend some time reacquainting the fans with his mission statement that he started over a year ago. It'll be critical that they go back and revisit a lot of the stuff on Raw and start devoting television time to getting him involved with Roman more frequently. But I'm telling you, man, I talked about this a little bit on one of the SmackDown reviews we did. If they decide they don't want to put the belt on Cody immediately, that they don't want to pull the trigger as soon as WrestleMania. We saw a little bit of the teaser right here. Cody versus Gunther for the Intercontinental Championship. That'd be a hell of a program. Again, it's probably the right call to have Cody be the one to beat Roman at Mania. And again, I'll elaborate more on this at a later time when we're not trying to review an entire 4+ hour pay-per-view marathon in one sitting. But man, those two were working so well together at the end of this thing. The last 5 minutes was absolutely fantastic. And you just think to yourself, man, seeing only 5 minutes of this thing, I could go another 15 to 20 watching these two work together. And the stuff with Gunther and Cody really made me crave wanting to see those guys do a singles program. And you know, that's not to say there aren't possible ways of working your way up to that point. Say, even if they have Cody beat Roman for the title at Mania, they can always do title versus title. You know, say like a SummerSlam, for example. Imagine a winner-take-all scenario with IC champion Gunther going up against Universal champion Cody Rhodes for all the gold. You could do that. I don't see anybody beating Gunther for the IC title in the interim, so, I mean, there's always that possibility. But I think the one thing that was surprising about all this by the end, no Sami Zayn. And granted, by the time we got to number 29 when Logan Paul came out, you know, the cat was already out of the bag with who's winning. Cody was the only entrant left, and if it wasn't Cody going over here, then without Sami being involved, there weren't really any other likely contenders. Granted, I guess they could have thrown a curveball in there and had Logan Paul or even Gunther win the thing, but with the story lead in, with everything Cody's been through in the last year, it wasn't up for debate in this case. Cody had to win this thing. You know, but I wonder also if that was careful strategizing on their part by not putting Sami in the Rumble match. I wonder if they were afraid it was going to muddy things up with Cody's return. Because if Sami ended up getting eliminated and the fans didn't take too kindly to it, it could have hijacked this entire match. You know, instead of it being Cody's big conquering return, it would have been a Bryan Danielson circa 2014 moment where the people turn on the whole show because their guy didn't win the thing. So maybe it was a wise move by keeping Sami out of this thing entirely just to ensure that didn't happen. And again, looking back at everything, yes, it went well over an hour, almost an hour and 15 minutes, I think, by the end. It was long, it was plotting. By and large, I don't think it was all that engaging outside a couple key angles and spots that I talked about. But once we got to Cody's return and some of the interplay in the last 5 to 10 minutes, it was a satisfying, fitting payoff. So from there, it is all downhill. Trumpin' Jesus Jehoshaphat. A while and ball your eyed mate. What in the French fried total titty fuck was this abomination? Boy howdy. And it was indeed Boy Howdy himself. Or Uncle Howdy. We knew it was going to suck. We were waiting with bated breath to see just how rotten and appalling the thing would end up being. I predicted -5 stars. The question was, did it live up to the expectation? So apparently, the Mountain Dew Pitch Black match is a no DQ match, I think, except they dim the lights in the building to create glow-in-the-dark effects, and they just spam the Mountain Dew logos all over the place. Looked like a goddamn strip club is what it looked like. It's Bray Wyatt versus LA Knight. Bray's actual first wrestling match back since his return. The last time we saw Bray work a match in WWE, it was before he got fired last year. And I believe one of the lasting images we ever saw of him in the ring was getting set on fire by Randy Orton and burnt to a crisp. That was our lasting image of Bray Wyatt the Fiend before his abrupt, untimely departure. So, after literally months and months of the nondescript, go-nowhere, illogical, indecipherable promos, after the spooky, eerie Uncle Howdy vignettes, after Bray not being able to figure out whether he was portraying Dr. Jekyll or Mr. Hyde on camera, we finally get to see Bray actually wrestle again. What I presume to be some kind of payoff after having to suffer through all this horse shit on SmackDown for the better part of 3 months. And this is what we got. A 5-minute glow-in-the-dark laser tag jerk-off session. A match that made the exploding barbed wire death match look like a 5-star classic. A match that made all of Russo's asinine gimmick matches actually seem rational by comparison. Seriously, how am I even supposed to break this down? It was Bray Wyatt playing Halloween dress-up while LA Knight was handcuffed to having to participate in it. They did some horrible, garbage-looking spots for a few minutes, half of which were barely visible anyway because of the darkened arena. At one point, they tried a spot where Bray was going to suplex LA Knight through the announce desk from the ring steps, but when Bray went to set Knight down so he could land on the barricade, Knight ended up slipping off because he couldn't see where his feet were landing. Because, you know, it was dark in the arena. Because they had to do a pitch black match for Christ knows what reason. And at the very end, Knight tried to attack Bray with a kendo stick, but Bray just grabbed him, hit him with Sister Abigail, and pinned him. And the crowd farted at it, as expected. Prior to everything they did afterwards, at least I could say up until this point, at the very most, I can merely say this was stupid. I was half expecting a blindfold match scenario where they turn off all the lights in the arena to create the illusion that the fans were the ones being blindfolded. At least in a sense like that, I could argue that would have been a benefit, because then we wouldn't have had to see anything they actually did, and we can just use our imaginations to visualize the stupidity. So the match itself was a dud. The aftermath stuff was where the negative star rating came into play. Because after the match, Bray goes over to the corner and puts on some freaky-looking Halloween mask, and he begins stalking LA Knight through the crowd while Knight is trying to fend the guy off with a kendo stick. And Bray ends up chasing Knight over to one of the equipment areas where all the stagehands usually hang out. Bray gives Knight the mandible claw, chokes him out, at which point I said, okay, well, again, that was stupid, but at least it wasn't retarded. And then apparently Bray overheard me saying that aloud, so he said, oh, I'll do you one better, son. At which point, Uncle Howdy shows up on one of the platform risers. He looks down at Bray momentarily. And as soon as I saw the guy standing up there, it hit me the moment they showed him on camera. This motherfucker's about to dive off the platform, isn't he? Sure enough, he dives off the platform, essentially takes a flat back bump through the gimmick platform. I can't even call it a Macho Man elbow drop because he essentially just committed suicide on a live broadcast. I think the goal was for him to make contact with LA Knight. I'm like 90% sure he completely missed, and the camera made sure to also avoid filming it because, you know, he missed. And I guess somehow him diving through this gimmicked platform also summoned the ability to shoot fire through the floor. Because wrestling is phony, you see. At least through the lens of the way Bray Wyatt views this sport. And of course, to make matters even more idiotic, while Bray is looking down through the platform, his puppet friends appear on the riser above him, and they all just kind of stand there looking like dopes. And that was it. This, I wrote down, was some grade A fucking bullshit. Up until the post-match stuff, where Bray Wyatt appeared to absorb magical powers by putting on a new mask and Uncle Howdy's stage diving into a fire pit, before all that crap, I was merely shaking my head. After seeing this play out in full, well, I determined a couple things. Number one, LA Knight's career is dead in the water. I mean, he may as well retire now. There's no point of return for him. More importantly, though, Bray Wyatt can go sodomize himself with a rusty fishing hook. And I genuinely mean that. I can also guarantee you, after having watched this monstrosity, if I ever walk into a drugstore past the cooler section and see Mountain Dew Pitch Black being sold, I'll probably be punching a hole through the door. So that sucked a mass cock. So much so that I could not even stomach the ability to subject myself to the next match. It was Alexa Bliss versus Bianca Belair for the Raw Women's Championship. And especially when you factor in that Alexa Bliss is apparently getting tied in with this Bray Wyatt horse shit again as well, I said, absolutely fucking not. So I happily got up, took this time to go brush my teeth and do anything possible to avoid making eye contact with this. Plus, the Girls' Rumble match was after this, so I needed to sort of prepare myself with a few shots of bourbon before we got to that point. Bianca retained, after which, while I was out of the room, I heard some ominous voice that sounded like Uncle Howdy asking, "Do you feel in control?" over and over again. To which I answered with, "No, but I feel nauseous." Like I'm ready to put a gun in my mouth. So, the hits just keep on coming, don't they? Then came the second marathon match. By the time they rang the bell for the start of this, I was already about midway through glass number 2. I was merely feeling the effects of the booze, but I was still a little too sober to sit through an hour of watching this thing without having a mental breakdown. Obviously, I'm talking about the Women's Royal Rumble match. And with where I was at this point in the show, here's what I can tell you about my viewing experience. I had this on in the background. I already knew the goddamn thing was going to go an hour plus anyway. Only this time, I knew I had to sit through a bunch of mediocre girl wrestlers instead of semi-decent to great male workers. And the question really is, at this point, do I want to save my rant for the end of this, or just get it out of the way now and set the stage. Yeah, fuck it. I'm already in a foul mood anyway. May as well just come out and talk about it. And I actually got the inspiration to elaborate more on this topic after listening to Jim Cornette's Experience episode this past week, because he and Brian Last dedicated almost an entire half-hour segment to the show where they were talking about women's wrestling, the state of women's wrestling as a whole, mostly bringing it back to today's product. Quite frankly, I don't think they were harsh enough on this, because this is something that's bothered me for a long time now. And unlike most people out there, I'm one of the only people that'll probably have the balls to talk about this out loud, because I have nothing to lose. So here it goes. One of the worst things to placate professional wrestling in the last 10 or so years is this equity for all, equal rights for men and women in wrestling bullshit. I'm sick of hearing about it. I'm tired of having this propaganda forced down my throat. And I'm tired of this argument of, well, if the men can do it, the women should get to do it too. At some point, someone's got to put their foot down and say, no, fuck you, enough is enough, we're not doing this anymore. This whole women's revolution agenda in wrestling, this whole push for women need equal dedication and equal screen time devoted to their material as the men, this argument needs to stop. And it needs to stop now. I've been a wrestling fan since I was basically 4 years old. And in that time, I've seen a lot of women's wrestling. Some good, plenty of bad, not a whole lot of middle ground in between. And while there have been plenty of female stars in wrestling throughout my life, lots of great female wrestlers, great female managers, great female valets, great female personalities, at no point in my time viewing wrestling has the incessant push for female wrestling in a modern market bothered me more than it does today. Because at no other point in modern history has the female market for wrestling been more sucky than it is today. It's called oversaturation. And at some point, you've got to ask yourself, point blank, even if you're the most die-hard fan of female wrestling out there, I know those people exist, but hear me out. Even if you take nothing away from the rant I'm about to go on, ask yourself at some point, what's the real reason for featuring women's wrestling in today's climate? Be honest with yourself. Is it that you're actually fighting for equal rights for women? Or is it that you're trying to defend some corporate media agenda because executives are trying to appease a bunch of radical SJWs complaining that women are still perceived as sex objects in this business? Well, I'll tell you this up front. For AEW, it's easy. Normally, they have one bad women's match every week, and I can easily skip through it because it's 15 minutes. Even the AEW hardcore fans will openly admit in most cases, they don't give two shits about the women's division in that product. And it shows based on the way the ratings usually churn out. WWE is a different animal entirely, because now they're even going out of their way to dedicate about half their pay-per-view cards to girls segments. And we can sit here for hours and argue whether or not it's justified given the current market or demand for women's wrestling. But it's also important for everyone to understand that, historically speaking, whether or not you want to admit this or not, it's the God's honest truth. Women's wrestling in the traditional sense has always and probably will always be seen as an attraction. We've had this discussion on the channel before. Same with how the midgets were an attraction back in the day. They weren't things that got pounded down everybody's throat nonstop because, yes, they had a purpose. Yes, they had a place. And in the right circumstance and in the right environment, when it called for it, you would do these kinds of matches as a special feature. And I know everybody's going to immediately jump to the, well, times have changed argument. But if you're going to throw that blanket statement at me, let's analyze how this reflects in the product today. Women's wrestling as a whole. Is it moving the needle? I'm not just explicitly talking about WWE. I'm going to throw AEW in that equation. Hell, I'll throw any wrestling product in that equation. NWA, whatever's left of Ring of Honor at this point, even the indies. Does women's wrestling really matter? No. It doesn't. Do people actively seem to give a shit about whether or not the girls are featured in segments or matches in wrestling today? At least in the mainstream products. Based on the ratings, not particularly. You know, and especially now that WWE has run the gauntlet with these women's Rumble matches and these women's Money in the Bank matches and the women's this gimmick match and women's that gimmick match. For no other reason than the guys do it, so the women should get to do it too. That's the only justification for them ever doing these matches. It's never been called for. There's never been a real rhyme or reason to do it in story. They just do it because equity. Because equal rights. How much of it's actually justified? Especially for a Rumble match which is supposed to feature the most elite of all the elite talent. Here's my question. Why does it even matter for the girls' division? Don't they have 2 sets of champions? So who gives a shit? Say whoever wins the Rumble match here, whether they get to challenge for the Raw Women's Champion or the SmackDown Women's Champion, who cares? It's the same fucking belt. One's red, one's blue. It doesn't matter. More so at that point, you're just aiming to fight the champion. You know, and again, talking about how the Rumble match used to be perceived, used to feature the best of the best, the main event stars. And I'm sitting here watching a girls' Rumble match with involvement from chicks like Emma and Dana Brooke and Liv Morgan, Candice LeRae, and fucking Nia Jax of all people. I guess she's back now to botch her way through another run and potato half the goddamn roster. And I'm only scratching the surface of all this, but my God, dude. Coming from somebody that's actually seen good women's wrestling before, someone that actually values women's wrestling as a commodity to the business when done right, I'll be the first to tell you straight to your face, this bullshit 50-50 featuring of men and women segments in wrestling has killed the business. Dead. I've had it. And I don't care what people say, because for the actual talented girls out there that come along, the Becky Lynches, the Rhea Ripleys, the Bianca Belairs of the world, the ones that have actually earned that right to be featured in those top spots, it's also minimized by the subsequent trail of absolutely horrible female workers. The Shotzi Blackhearts, the Alexa Blisses. Let's be honest, half the NXT female roster, most of them suck. Some of them even got brief runs here. Up to and including Indy Hartwell, who still doesn't look like she's improved any since she was plumping Dexter Lumis about a year and a half ago. She's still the shits. I did get a kick out of Corey Graves' shoot rant on the stupidity of people helping to stop individuals from eliminating one another in these matches. Basically just pointing out how dumb the idea is that somebody would go out of their way to help somebody not get eliminated. Because it's stupid. Yeah, we see it virtually every year because most of these numbnuts have no idea what the fuck they're doing, and nobody agents them properly. You know, and again, I watched this girls' Rumble match in passing. Had it on, I was doing some stuff while it was going on. Occasionally I would stop to check in when somebody impressive came out. So, see the aforementioned 3 or 4 girls I mentioned a minute ago. But I'll go back to what I said about the men's Rumble match in the opener. Where were the stars? Where were the top female attractions? Some of them were hidden in here, intermittently strewn in throughout the 60-minute clusterfuck. But again, for the Becky Lynches of the world, the Rhea Ripleys, or even the Asukas. You also had a lot of dreck surrounding it. One of the more pleasant surprises here was seeing Zoe Stark again. I remember Zoe Stark from NXT. I like Zoe. She showed a lot of promise toward the tail end of that whole black and gold era of the brand. I thought she was going to be a big deal when she got called up to the main roster. You know, I know she had that really serious injury that kind of put her on the shelf for a long time. Didn't she have some kind of like ACL tear or something? She looked pretty good from what I saw. But again, even someone like her, yeah, there's potential there, but she's got a long way to go. And for the amount of time she's been in developmental, at some point you got to ask yourself, is there ever going to be a point where she does make it to the main roster? I don't know. Again, the ring just filling in with more bodies at this point. Most of them are just blech. Some overweight chick named Piper Niven came in at one point, to which Pat McAfee kept screaming, "Piper Niven!" over and over again. Like, I apparently was just supposed to know who the fuck she was. I had no idea who Piper Niven was. I guess she was on NXT UK for a period of time. Good for her. Chelsea Green was an interesting surprise. Probably not the first woman I would have called to make a special guest appearance in the Royal Rumble, but she got a mildly decent pop when she came out. Then, of course, she got immediately dumped in like 3 seconds, so it was all for naught. Glad they gave her a payday to come in and do all of nothing. Not that I'm really complaining. I mean, I never really liked Chelsea Green all that much to begin with. I still have PTSD from that garbage she was doing in Impact years ago. But, you know, Zelina Vega was out there doing video game cosplay at one point, which is just trash. Kind of figured we were bound to get a Michelle McCool cameo at some point. Taker's got a lot more sway in WWE than a lot of people think. And, you know, she came in through the front row while she was holding one of her kids, which was oddly amusing. You know, dude, even saying this, you know, Michelle McCool, at this stage, I take her over half the girls that got signed right now. You know, she was kind of part of the whole Divas era of WWE, which was garbage too. But, I mean, at least Michelle kind of stood out amongst the pack back then. She could at least cut a halfway decent promo. But again, though, dude, listen to these names. Zelina Vega, Dana Brooke, Liv Morgan, Nikki Cross, Shotzi Blackheart, Tegan Nox, Dakota Kai, Io Shirai. I mean, even with some of these girls, you know, I've given them praise in the past. I liked Io better personally when she was in NXT being pushed as a single star instead of a flunky for Bayley. Same goes with Dakota. I still don't get the whole damage control thing or why people care. But what's the trade-off? Even when you get girls like Rhea or Becky or Asuka in there, you get 20-something other bodies of void filler, most of which aren't good workers and look greener than goose shit. Nia Jax's return really didn't even get that big of a pop. I still think people are sour on her from the initial run. I mean, the chick can never get through a program without hurting somebody. Just an unprofessional piece of shit she was. I mean, she should have never been called up to the main roster in the first place, but of course, because she's a blood relative of The Rock, she gets preferential treatment. Didn't make up for the fact that she always sucked. This shit's just terrible, people. I'm sorry. Some of them were nice to look at, but, you know, then I watch most of them grab a hold, and I'm like, the hell are they putting these girls in front of 50,000 plus people on the main roster for? And if that makes me a horrible person for just being blunt about this, fine. I'll take the heat. I want to watch good wrestling. I don't want to watch a bunch of Barbie dolls cosplaying as wrestlers. And it's worse in WWE than it is AEW. Because as bad as a lot of the girls' matches are on AEW, again, I only usually have to put up with it for about 15 minutes every week, more or less, as opposed to half a fucking pay-per-view card. You know, the Royal Rumble is supposed to be one of the big events they host every year, too. And I don't know. I can't even justify them continuing to do these things. Because as long as you've got corporate suits trying to mollify the lowest common denominator of wrestling fans, this is the kind of shit you can expect from a publicly traded company. Most of these girls aren't stars. No one gives a shit about them outside the core group of girls I mentioned a minute ago that are actually talented. The rest of them are just there to fill up space. And if you don't like hearing it, tough shit. Because look at the way that people react. Whether it's WWE or AEW, most people don't care. They might pretend to, but it doesn't reflect in the overall numbers, people. You ask me, I advocate for things going back to the way they were when girls' matches were actual special attractions. Where you don't feature them every week, so when you got to see them, it actually felt like a big deal. And if that makes me a bigot or misogynist, I don't give a fuck. Just give you my God's honest opinion based on what I see being presented to me. From someone that's been a wrestling fan for over 25 years. Just can't do it. You want to put Rhea Ripley out there on television every week to squash girls that are 5'2" and weigh 90 pounds? Cool. I can get down with that. You want to throw Bianca out there for the occasional title defense? Cool. I can do that. But with the way they've been doing this stuff, at least from what I've seen on SmackDown, it ain't cutting the mustard, dog. Hasn't been for a long time now. And again, the people that are praising the ever-loving fuck out of this Divas Revolution or Women's Revolution garbage, it's the same people that honestly, if they eliminated women's wrestling from this company altogether, I guarantee you they wouldn't bat an eyelash. In fact, I'd bet money on it. It's not as big a deal as people think. You can pretend it's a big deal, but it's not. It's the reality of the situation. Always has been, always will be. This has always been a man's sport. And it's going to continue to stay that way for the end of time. It's about time people start recognizing that and acknowledging it. Don't be a bunch of pussies. Oh, but I don't want to offend anybody because it's wrong to say that. No, it's not. It's being realistic. It's being red-pilled is what it is. God almighty. So with that said, we're going to round things out with talking about this main event with Kevin Owens and Roman Reigns for the Universal Championship. At the point they rang the bell for this thing, we were basically closing in on hour 4. My brain was about halfway melted by this point. And I was just kind of wanting to get to the end of this thing because I about had enough. I was tired. I was cranky. I just had to sit through almost a full 2 hours of nothing but bad girls wrestling, preceded by a fucking abortion of a Bray Wyatt angle. So you have to pardon me if I wasn't the most enthusiastic by this point. But I stuck the course. I did it for the Bloodline. And I repeat what I said at the top of the program. Had it not been for the actual afterbirth following the match, I don't think I would have been able to make it through the next morning. It's not to say the match was bad, because it really wasn't. But it was just kind of a match. No one bought that KO was beating Roman here, even with the mid-match angles they were doing with Sami Zayn. They tried to give it the feel of a big main event match, but overall it just didn't really click. You know, poor Owens was kind of having an off night. He ended up slipping off the turnbuckle, trying that leaping moonsault he's done in the past. I mean, I thought he about killed himself when he fell back on the ring mat. Of course, they went through some series of near falls, which the crowd mostly reacted to. They do still pop when Roman is in jeopardy, because even the mere idea of Roman getting his shoulders pinned to the mat is such a nail biter at this point. But they end up doing the sequence where the ref gets bumped. Owens got the visible 3 count while the ref was down after he hit the pop-up powerbomb. But Roman wound up catching him with a groin shot about a minute later. At which point, Roman calls for Sami to grab a chair. And Sami's reluctant to do so because Roman made it abundantly clear that he did not want Sami to get involved or do anything. But it's do or die time with the official being out momentarily, so Roman's insistent that Sami does what he's told. So Sami goes to grab the chair, and while he's holding on to it, Roman's waiting for him to feed the chair to him, but he keeps holding off. And finally, Sami slides the thing in after all the hesitation, which gives Owens enough time to hit the stunner on Roman. And the people actually went ballistic for that near fall, because they actually thought that was a believable finish. And at this point, Sami's selling the expression that he knows he fucked up. And all the while, there's Paul Heyman looking on mesmerized by the whole thing. He's probably contemplating getting on the phone with the local medical facility right then and there, because he knows Roman's going to ream this guy hard if he manages to get out of the ring with this title. So they do the angle on the floor where Owens is crawling over to the barricade, and Sami's trying to beg for Owens to just stay down. But Roman ends up running in the back door and spearing Owens through the barricade, at which point Roman tosses Owens back in so he can roll out to the other side. At which point they do this incredibly dangerous spot that I've never seen tried before, nor do I ever want to see them try again for as long as I live. But Roman grabs a handful of Owens, and he ends up throwing him backwards into the ring steps, where Owens ends up smacking the back of his head on the edge of the steps, not once, but fucking twice. I wrote down, who approved that? Whatever lame brain allowed that spot to happen needs to be fired immediately. And if it was Kevin's idea for coming up with the spot, he needs to be heavily fined. I'd have even contemplated firing the motherfucker if there wasn't such a demand for him in your company right now. Just a dumb, stupid, reckless spot for the sake of doing it. Contributed nothing to the match. And of course, right there, Reigns throws Owens back in the ring and hits him with another spear a minute later for the actual pinfall. As I noted, the match was nothing to write home about. The involvement with Sami was a good lead into what they did after the bell, but as a title match, again, partially it was because I was mentally drained by the time we even got here. I just wanted to be done and over with this fucking thing. So even if I tried, there was just no way I could muster up the ability to care. But for what it was, it was fine. The post-match angle, however, this is where the real meat of the matter comes into play. As tired as I was, as exhausted as I was, and as pissed off and frustrated as I was by this point, I said, well, if this is where they're actually going to blow all this off, I've invested all this time and effort into seeing how they were going to go about turning Sami. So I need to see how they do this. So the Bloodline go on the attack to Kevin. They're beating him into powder, just pulverizing this poor fucker. They end up putting him in the corner with a chair in front of his face so Solo can give him the big hip attack. They wind up handcuffing Kevin to the ropes with a double set of handcuffs. Paul Heyman was pretty great when he pulled out the cuffs and handed them to Roman. So they hitch up Owens to the ropes, crucifix style. The Usos are giving him multiple super kicks, not doing a very good job concealing the thigh slaps, but it's kind of where we are in today's business. During this melee, Michael Cole is begging and pleading for security to come out and do something, which is something I'm going to talk about after we go over all this. But finally, Roman goes to pick up the chair. And again, Owens is totally helpless by this point. No way of defending himself. The entire beatdown, Sammy's just kind of motionlessly standing there with Roman, not really knowing how to absorb all this. Deep down, he knows it's wrong, but yeah, he figures it'll be over soon. He can have time to sulk over it whenever the Bloodline's not around, because even he knows that friendship with Kevin Owens, it still lingers in there. But Roman's looking to finish the deed. He's going to smash Owens over the head with his fucking chair as hard as he can. But he goes to wind up, and Sammy gets in the line of fire and tells him he doesn't have to do this. This is all beneath him. He's the tribal chief, blah, blah. So Roman's standing there contemplating it for a minute. And that's when he decides that Sammy's right. It is beneath him to put Kevin Owens out of his misery like this. Which is exactly why Sammy's going to do it. He's pledged his allegiance to the Bloodline. So now he has to live up to his word. And if he refuses to do it, he can go back to doing chump-ass shit. Directly quoted from Roman's mouth here, which I thought was pretty funny. And Sammy's still reluctant to do so. So Roman slaps him in the face and starts berating him. Tells him that the Bloodline is his life and that Sammy's not about to screw this up for him right now. So he tells him to do it. And he turns around to look at Owens. He picks the chair and has it in prone position. And Sammy does it. He makes the decision in the moment. And he does what he believes was the right call. And he clocks Roman in the back with his fucking chair as hard as he can. And Roman goes down in a heap doing the best sell of a chair shot. He's hunched over in pain and Sammy's looking down at him. No regrets. And obviously now's the point where Jimmy and Solo put the boots to Sammy and start pounding him into sand. And they're beating on the guy forever. Roman's ripping at Sammy's honorary Oos t-shirt. The people are passionately behind Sammy the whole time. They're vehemently chanting, "Fuck you, Roman." And everyone's participating in the gang warfare. Except for one man. Jey Uso. Because he and Sammy still have a storied history. Sammy won Jey's friendship over. And Jey can't bring himself to participate in this beatdown. So he walks out and starts making his way up the ramp. Meanwhile, Roman and the rest of the crew are stomping away on Sammy. And this mass beatdown goes on for like another 2 or 3 minutes. At which point they cut the camera back to Jey, who is still walking up the aisleway to the back. Because again, this was about a 9-hour walk from getting to the ring to the locker room. This is a very funny visual. Jey Uso actually might be still making his way to the locker room as we speak. It may have taken him a solid 2 days to get up that aisleway. But all joking aside, the show ended with the Bloodline leaving the ring and looking at Sammy and Owens' dead carcasses sprawled out in the middle. Roman's looking back, realizing there's no turning back now. It was conflicting because it was one of the greatest angle payoffs I've seen WWE do in a very, very long time. At the same time, with a few glaring issues and a couple major nitpicks. One of which is a major problem as we approach WrestleMania, but I'll talk about the nitpicks first. Firstly, going back to the Cole comment, him asking where the hell security was during this whole thing, the answer was, I have no idea where anybody was. They had no problem bringing out officials earlier when Brock Lesnar was destroying the ringside area after he got eliminated from the Rumble match. Or later on when Beth Phoenix and Rhea Ripley had the pull-apart deal on the rampway during the men's Rumble match. People came out to pull them apart. But in this 10-minute beatdown angle to close out the show, not a soul came out to help. No referees, no cops, no wrestlers. They all just apparently clocked out for the night. Just said, nah, fuck it. Sammy and Kevin are on their own. So that was a gaping plot hole. Second issue, and again, this goes back to the fatigue thing. At the point they shot this angle, as great as it was, as beautifully executed as it came off on TV, it was almost a quarter after midnight, Eastern time. I'm like, how in the fuck am I still awake to watch this thing, much less even process what just happened? Had they done this exact same thing at an earlier point in the show where I wasn't half asleep and ready to gouge somebody's eyeballs out, may have had a different perspective on it. As great as it was, this was also happening well past the 4th hour mark of this never-ending marathon. At this point, I didn't want to see anything after the title match. I wanted them to cut the feed so I can go to bed. But again, that's more of a nitpicky thing. I think overall, here's my big issue. Again, I'm going to preface this by saying, I love the angle. The people popped for Sammy's face turn. The beatdown was great. The drama was there. Everybody worked their roles to perfection. Sammy was the biggest sympathetic babyface by the end of it. Roman was a beast. Jey Uso acting conflicted about the whole thing got the right reaction. This all panned out exactly how it needed to. I loved it. How is this supposed to get me to want to see Roman Reigns versus Cody Rhodes? I don't want to see Roman versus Cody after this. I want to see Roman versus Sammy. Now again, it's entirely possible we wind up getting that match, but the end result has to be Sammy beating Roman, which means that match is either going to have to be non-title or they end up having Cody wrestle Roman on night 1 of WrestleMania, lose, and then have Sammy be the one to beat Roman the following night. Which would work well in favor of Sammy in storyline, but would also kind of cut off Cody's balls from under him. Originally, it seemed like the game plan was to do the Usos versus Owens and Sammy for the tag titles, but after seeing what they did with Jey here, now I'm not entirely so sure. Unless they do that match anyway and Jey ends up turning his back on the Bloodline too, which, yeah, I guess that would make sense as well. There are a lot of ways they could go with that creatively, and it'd be great in that sense. But again, where does that leave Cody in the end? That, I think, is their big dilemma right now. Do they really want to have Cody be the one to dethrone Roman? They could. There is a story for that. But with what they did in the final angle here, maybe now's not the time. They kind of unintentionally painted themselves into a corner for how good this all was. Because Sammy's the hottest babyface coming out of this thing, not Cody. It's going to be very interesting to see how this all develops in the next couple months. I'm intrigued. I just wish this angle didn't come at the expense of me being completely dog-tired by the time we got to it. Otherwise, I'd be saying this is the greatest thing WWE's done in well over 30 years. So, I spent a long time talking about this show. I'm just going to give you some overall thoughts, and you can all chime in down below with what you thought. There were two great things coming out of this. The final 5 minutes of the opening match with Cody winning the Rumble and the closing 10-minute angle with the Bloodline. Everything else in the middle was like slow Chinese water torture. The Bray Wyatt match was absolutely rotten. The Women's Championship match was my piss break segment, although it seemed moderately short based on how long I was out of the room. But again, it's just a total pointless throwaway title match. I mean, it was completely predictable. The Women's Rumble match was a dumpster fire by and large. I don't even think I mentioned the fact that Rhea Ripley won the thing. Did I even talk about that? If I failed to mention it, yeah, Rhea won. Not that there were any likely candidates aside from her. So, good. I love Rhea. I don't really know what title she chases after. I mean, with the way they have it set up right now, she could viably go after Bianca or Charlotte because they're both baby faces, and I think Rhea's a heel. It's hard to tell anymore in modern wrestling because nobody cheers or boos the right people, but I think Rhea's supposed to be a bad guy. Or bad girl, villain, sorry. Gender norms. But personally, I like to see Rhea get her revenge on Charlotte after Charlotte buried her 2 years ago. That'd be kind of nice. Because fuck Charlotte. But by that same token, her and Bianca could be a really solid title match. But because here's the problem too. If, let's say, for example, Rhea goes after Charlotte, what does that leave for Bianca? They've already done her and Becky, right? So I don't think there's really a reason to go back to the well with that again. I don't know. And again, it's just, I'm contemplating things, but again, who are we primarily talking about here when it comes to the women? It's great that Rhea won, but out of the scope of the girls I just mentioned, Bianca, Rhea, Becky, begrudgingly I have to throw her into that mix because in comparison to all the other girls, I mean, she is sort of a star, Charlotte. Everybody else, dude, is just, it's a case of why. Why bother? At one point, I really would have liked to see Bayley get that title run. It kind of would have made sense when the trio faction with her and Dakota and Io was sort of popular. Because weren't Io and Dakota tag champions at one point? Wouldn't that have made perfect sense to put the singles title on Bayley and just have them kind of be a dominant three-person trio? Would have made more sense than them just sort of hanging out in the periphery, not doing anything. Again, to this day, I still have no point with that, or I still have no idea what the point of that faction is. It's just, it's a mess. It's a complete mess. Then I already talked about the main event title match. It was okay. Not really a memorable title match. I don't think it's something people would go out of their way to seek again in the next 3 or 4 months. They won't really be talking about that, much less they'll be talking about the post-match angle. And that was great. But man, the road to get there was just brutal. Absolutely, positively brutal. There was a lot to be had in this conversation. So I hope people don't automatically dismiss it as me just shitting on girls wrestling. Not shitting on girls wrestling. I'm shitting on the concept of girls wrestling as it's presented today. Because it sucks. And again, if people don't like hearing that, I don't know what to tell you. Look at how it reflects in the ratings. Anyway, so Retro Raw, yeah, because we still have one of those to do. With whatever remaining energy I have left, we're going to trudge through this thing. So we are officially 15 days removed from the 1994 Royal Rumble pay-per-view. Last week's show was kind of a bust. Just a bunch of nothing happening squashes and boring TV. Not a whole lot in terms of pay-per-view fallout. But now we've had a chance to simmer on the fallout to the Royal Rumble match. Of course, Brett and Luger both being co-winners of the Royal Rumble. They've had well over 2 weeks to come up with a game plan to figure out who will be battling Yokozuna for the WWF Championship at WrestleMania. 2 full weeks to think of something clever, something innovative, something that'll really have people on the edge of their seats sitting in anticipation. So as all great businessmen do when overcome with a life-altering important decision to make for their company, they flip a coin. Sounds like the apropos thing to do in a situation like this. Now, obviously, there's more to the story, and we'll cover that shortly, but I just like how their selling point for Monday Night Raw was tune in to see who gets the title shot at WrestleMania via coin flip. Because in the world of combat sports, that is how every number one contender is determined for a shot at the top belt. You just pick heads or tails. It's the most fair, impartial way to conduct business. Now, I'll also say one thing from the beginning here. This was a much better episode of Raw than last week, in the sense that at least I can say stuff happened on this show, as opposed to 45 minutes of nothing but straight boring squashes, most of which weren't any good to begin with. So I'll try to be a little more thorough in my breakdown of everything. I've made it a concerted effort to try and provide more detailed reviews, especially for the retro content. Figuring I'm going out of my way to watch the shows again, I may as well put in the same effort in my recaps that goes into me sitting down and actually watching them again. And I couldn't help but write down the location they were at for this Raw taping. They were in Bushkill, Pennsylvania, at the Fernwood Resort. And I think we've made a passing joke about Bushkill, PA before. As a resident of the state, I can tell you up front, I have never heard of any place called Bushkill, Pennsylvania until I started watching these retro Raws. According to Wikipedia, it does exist. The population consists of about 40 people and a few bears. And when I went to learn more information about the Fernwood Resort, not only did I come to realize that it was a hotel, but when you type in the venue on Wikipedia, there's a giant red bar that pops up on the map portion that says, permanently closed. So if y'all were looking to spend some quality extended vacation time at the Fernwood Resort in Bushkill, Pennsylvania, well, you're out of luck, unfortunately, because that shit shut down. Apparently there's a Fernwood horseback riding venue, though. Although I have no clue where East Stroudsburg, PA is. Basically, if it's not Pittsburgh, Philly, or Harrisburg, you can probably assume that the rest of the state is farm country. And albeit while I love me some rural Amish farm country in PA, it is one of the states where if you live anywhere outside the suburbs, that's basically what you're getting. Trump country, to put it bluntly. So here at the Fernwood Resort, Vince McMahon and IRS were our commentators for the night. And right out of the gate, IRS has to make sure that he mentions the recent winners of the Publishers Clearinghouse sweepstakes. That way he can promise to show up to their front door and collect half the income for taxes. Which sounds about accurate. Win big prizes, give half the money to the government anyway. That's why I think people are suckers for playing the lottery. But again, that's just me with the controversial takes. But the actual opener was Marty Jannetty versus Johnny Polo. Originally supposed to be Polo versus the 1-2-3 Kid, but Waltman ended up getting hurt before the 94 Royal Rumble pay-per-view, which is why he was not part of that show. Apparently it was an issue with his leg, but he was out for commentary during this. And Rotunda actually had a good line when Waltman came out for his entrance. He asked him to show proof of valid insurance, which also meant that he needed to show a driver's license. Get it? Because Sean Waltman looks like a 14-year-old. At least he did back in the 90s. So Polo does the Heat promo beforehand. Says the snot-nosed kid is feigning an injury because he was too afraid to wrestle Polo tonight. He actually did some real fun comedy stuff here at the beginning with Jannetty. Back when the WWF did not have wireless microphones, and all the mics had those giant cables running from the PA system to the actual microphone output. So Jannetty ends up tying Polo's ankles into the cord so Polo can't stand upright. Match was pretty decent overall. Yeah, if you've been following in the Raw timeline with me, Polo had been doing the on and off program with Jannetty and Kid for a while now. Yeah, they've already established Polo as sort of the flunky goofball manager for the Quebecers, so even though we've seen Polo have plenty of competitive matches here and there, he's also somebody that can do the comedy spots, and it's actually believable. And when I say comedy spots, I don't mean all the hokey, stupid shit you see everybody do in today's business where everything's just exposed and they make you want to shut the show off in disgust. Yeah, I'm talking things as basic as crotching a guy on the top rope or having him bump around like a pinball. Believable things. Things you could play up for laughs, but at the same time, they don't insult your intelligence. You know, Jannetty was obviously a good worker in his heyday, so he carried a lot of the action here. To be fair, Polo was good too. I don't want to dismiss him entirely, but, Jannetty was definitely the better in-ring technician. IRS and Waltman actually played off pretty well together on commentary. One of my favorite little banters was something that happened toward the end. Casually at one point, IRS just goes, "Hey kid, isn't it past your bedtime?" And without hesitation, in the most dry-cut retort imaginable, Waltman just goes, "Not yet." Good response. Vince actually quoted this as being a seesaw back-and-forth match, which is probably the most accurate way I can describe it. And moments later, Jannetty caught Polo in some kind of weird facebuster dilly-bob and got the pin. IRS making sure to point out that move should be banned because, he's a heel. And for the record, I don't know what you would call that move. Imagine Jeff Jarrett setting up somebody for that stroke finish he used to do in WCW, the face-first Russian leg sweep, except you basically grab a hold of the guy's arm and drop him face first that way. Well, it was creative, as was their afterbirth angle they shot here. And when I say creative, I mean they ended up making IRS look like the biggest dork you've ever seen. After the bell, Waltman and Rotunda end up getting into a scuffle, and while the 1-2-3 kid's stumbling on the ground, Jannetty comes in from the other side and starts pounding away on Rotunda. And while all that's going on, the camera is just nonchalantly filming the 1-2-3 kid, not running, not scurrying, but hobbling away in slow motion carrying the briefcase. That would be IRS's briefcase for the record. Because during the match, Waltman had made passive jokes that IRS still had possession of Razor Ramon's gold chains. Chains that Razor had ample time to take back when he was actually wrestling IRS at the pay-per-view for the title. 2 weeks later, I guess IRS still had possession of them. And all it took was approximately 25 seconds of television time for Sean Waltman to just nonchalantly steal the briefcase back. Razor was completely incapable of doing it after working a near 15-minute pay-per-view match with the guy 2 weeks ago. But here on Monday Night Raw in the opening segment of the show, Waltman just grabs the briefcase and hobbles off with it unscathed. No issues at all. Crippled leg and all. Well, that was rather anticlimactic. Kind of made Razor look like a doofus. I just figured he didn't want the chains back. So they come back from break. IRS is trying to figure out where his stolen briefcase went off to. Apparently nobody took the time to clue him into the fact that Waltman had walked away with it in plain view right before the commercial break. So he's berating Vince at the desk and saying that he's going to go confront Jannetty and the kid because he knows they took it. So while he's walking up the aisle, Razor's music cues up, and out comes the bad guy with Jannetty by his side. And now Razor's got the gold chains back around his neck, and they're stalking him down the aisleway, only to wind up tossing the empty briefcase back at him. And of course, before they can come to blows, here come all the officials to get in between them and put a stop to all that chaos. So let it be known that the resolution of Razor's stolen chains came to a head here on Monday Night Raw 2 weeks after the pay-per-view. All it took was a scrappy underdog babyface to come in and steal the case while IRS was not looking. Go figure. All good things do come to pass eventually. But getting back on track with some more serious topics at hand. Speaking of things that needed resolving, President Jack Tunney is here to provide us with an update on how the Royal Rumble finish will be resolved tonight. We flippantly joked about the fact that they were going to merely determine the challenger for the WWF title at WrestleMania via coin toss. And, well, it's a little more elaborate than just a simple coin flip, so I'll do my best to summarize what Jack Tunney said in this pre-tape. And if you already know how WrestleMania 10 played out, this won't be a spoiler for you, but for anybody that may have not been clued into this or didn't really remember how they went about structuring that card based on the finish to the Rumble, so Luger and Brett were both guaranteed a title shot, and they broke down the two scenarios that would pan out depending on who won the coin flip. If Luger won the toss, he would face Yokozuna first, which by proxy meant that Brett would have to wrestle Owen as a suitable filler opponent in the interim. Depending on who won the initial Luger-Yokozuna title match, that man would then go on to wrestle Brett in the main event for the title. On the other hand, if Brett won the coin toss, he would face Yokozuna first, which would then pin Lex Luger in a filler match on the WrestleMania card against Crush. What? And from there, depending on who won between Brett and Yokozuna in the first match, Luger would then get his title shot in the main event. Is your brain still functioning? Well, I hope so. Because when they first explained this convoluted blueprint to me 30 years ago, I had no idea what the fuck they were talking about. Now, to be fair, I'm older and I've seen everything play out now, so this made a lot more sense hearing them explain it in 2023 as opposed to when I was young and watching this at home for the first time. It still doesn't really explain how Luger would wind up facing Crush, of all people. Wasn't Crush in the middle of a feud with Randy Savage? Why the fuck would Luger have a beef to settle with Crush? Moreover, why would they think that match is a suitable replacement match? Could you have imagined Crush versus Lex Luger on WrestleMania? Good Lord Almighty. Now, unless the idea was to do the blow-off with Luger and Ludwig Borga, that never happened. Because remember, they dropped the Borga character by this point, and they had teased that program but never actually executed with it. That would at least make sense in story. But I just remember seeing Crush's name pop up on the graphic and thinking, what? Luger versus Crush? The fuck? So, well, judging how things actually went down, the first scenario seemed a lot more probable anyway. factoring in Owen turning on Bret at the Royal Rumble. So, I mean, they already had this kind of spoiled ahead of time. And after making this, quote, fair and equitable decision to favor both parties, Jack Tunney also announced that there will be special guest referees assigned to both title matches, and those names would be revealed at a later date. Well, ultimately, here's what I can conclude about all this. This made a whole lot more sense in the Reverse Battle Royal. Truth be told, a lot of things in wrestling made more sense than the Reverse Battle Royal. Following that, Bam Bam Bigelow had a 2-minute squash with Miguel Rosado. And while I know this is a stolen catchphrase, not afraid to admit it, the first thing that I said when I saw Miguel Rosado was, this is the quintessential definition of what Jim Cornette means when he says a guy looks like a baked potato with arms and legs. No muscle tone, no bodily definition, just a fat, plumpy-looking dweeb. So naturally, Bam Bam killed him. All of this to apparently set up Bam Bam's long-anticipated TV match with Doink the Clown on WWF Superstars this coming weekend. Because that's still going on, apparently. Well, good thing it happened on Superstars. That way we don't have to talk about it. But we do have to talk about the long-awaited coin toss. That was my chair. No, never mind. So you got President Jack Tunney, Vince McMahon, as well as several other executives in the ring for this very prestigious coin toss. The only two men I recognized off the top of my head here were Jack Lanza and Dave Hebner, I think. The other three, I wouldn't have been able to pick them out of a police lineup. Now, in ensuring that there is no tomfoolery or subterfuge taking place in this most prestigious of all prestigious coin tosses, I mean, this is deciding the fate of WrestleMania, mind you, we have to get assurance from Vince McMahon here that the coin they are using for this has two sides, to which I paused for a very long time with my head down thinking, has Vince never seen a coin in his life? Isn't that the gimmick of a coin in the first place? It only has two sides. That's why it's been used in sports for years. What, do you think there was going to be a mysterious third side to this coin that would have thrown things out of whack even further? Or did you think it was like a double heads or a double tails coin? That would actually be a funny rib. Well, you'll be glad to hear this coin only had two sides. An American silver dollar, to be precise. So they bring out the cavalry to determine the fate of our WrestleMania card. Luger is the one that is appointed the task of calling it in the air. Evidently, he winds up choosing heads. And wouldn't you know who won the pony? It's heads. Well, at least the camera cut showed that it was heads. For all we know, live in the building, it could have ended up being tails. So, based on the stipulations from earlier, Luger will be getting the first title shot against Yokozuna, and if Luger manages to beat him in match 1, he will then go on to defend the belt later against Bret. And at the same time, that means Bret is now going to be forced to wrestle his brother Owen. The match that you'll recall from a few weeks back, Bret wanted no part of. He had refused to wrestle his brother Owen under any circumstance. Even though he now has a reason to fight Owen based on everything that transpired at the Rumble, now Bret is being forced into that spot. And he looked none too pleased about it. He said in his promo here that he didn't think it would come to this, but what's done is done. And if he has to do battle with his brother Owen to get one step closer to getting his WWF title shot, then so be it. And while Bret can't muster up the ability to wish Yokozuna luck, he considers Luger a formidable opponent, and he hopes it comes down to him and Luger at the end. So they shake hands, and we are officially off to the races for the WrestleMania 10 title match. Or matches, I should say. And at the same time, Owen and Bret is officially set in stone against Bret's better judgment. And now the only thing we need to figure out is who Jack Tunney is going to pick as the special guest referee for those opposing title matches. I think I've already kind of spoiled that in one of our recent Raw episodes. But if you were not paying attention or didn't catch it, I'll try to keep it under the radar for the time being. You know, we've already been over the whole failed experiment that was the Lex Express, so I don't think I'm breaking any hearts when I say that WrestleMania 10 was kind of the last stop on that journey before Vince kind of solely gave up on that. And you're going to see it play out, man. After WrestleMania 10, it is all downhill for Luger's run. This whole development over the next couple months is kind of what soiled the whole relationship between Vince and Luger. Because when Luger leaves midway through 95, remember, he never comes back to the WWE. Not for an appearance, not for a special one-off tribute, not for a blow-off match. Never. Luger's last real main event push in the WWF is coming to a closure very, very soon. And again, this did a lot of damage to Luger's relationship with Vince after the fact. It's kind of similar to how things kind of went down with the Steiners before they left a little later on, but, you know, Rick and Scott were never pushed as main eventers. Luger was at least somebody Vince had a lot of interest in at some point. And so often is the case with a guy like Vince. He just randomly gets cold with a guy, and that spells the end of it. How many times have we seen it pan out throughout the course of this company's history? Just the sad reality of Vince as a promoter. Just has zero patience for anything. Even back then. If Vince just woke up one day and decided, we're not doing this, that was it. There was no more conversation to be had. Kind of like how he had no patience for the failed gimmick that was Kwang. Or Quang. Still don't know how you fucking pronounce it. It's Savio Vega under a mask. How about that? Doing the stereotypical Asian martial arts gimmick. Pfft. At least we know where Eric Bischoff got the inspiration for Glacier a couple years later. At least Glacier lasted longer than Kwang did. I also loved how, for absolutely no reason at all, they just saddle him with Harvey Whippleman as a manager. Because that was apparently where all the failed gimmicks in WWF went when they needed a manager. Just throw him in with Harvey Whippleman. So he wrestled Rich Myers. And while this match was boring the brakes off of everybody in the arena, Owen Hart was on the phone line talking with Vince and IRS. Mostly talking trash on Bret. It was not as legendary as Owens' I kicked your leg out of your leg promo. The single most iconic moment of his career, bar none. Here he was more mellow and laid back and pretty stern about facing Bret at WrestleMania. He assured us that by the time he got finished with him, Bret wasn't even going to make it to the title match. So that's kind of all there was to that. Kwang won with something. Wasn't even paying attention. Doesn't matter. I know. So much for me trying to be more thorough and detailed in my recaps. After that, we went to Todd Pettingill for a WrestleMania report. And while I did my best to try and not cringe at Todd being the most Caucasian reporter the world has ever seen, here's basically everything I got out of it. As of this current taping in January, WrestleMania 10 at MSG is sold out. However, Tickets are still available for closed-circuited viewing at the Paramount Theater by calling Ticketmaster. And they actually left the number on screen, so I wonder if that number is still actually valid. I got to try that sometime, dialing those numbers while recording the podcast just to see what comes up on the other line 30 years later. For all we know, it could be a porn line. That would be high comedy. Only other thing covered here was the WWF title scenario, which we already talked about, so I don't really need to go into detail again about it. That is crazy, though, man. You go back and look at how fast those WrestleMania tickets sold back in the day. You know, now you read reports on the internet about WrestleMania struggling to sell tickets now in 2023 to the point where they've had to reduce prices just to try and get people in the fucking door. Hard to imagine that. Even back in 1994, when the product was in an all-time horrible state, they still never had a problem selling out WrestleMania. Take note of that. So moving along here, Paul Bearer was at the graveyard feeling the presence of Undertaker's spirit. As God is my witness, I actually wrote those words down verbatim. Somehow able to recite that without upchucking. I don't think I need to provide any further input. I about covered it all in that one sentence. And that took us directly to our main event. Corey Student wrestled the returning Don't Call Me John Tenta Earthquake. And if you're wondering where did he return from, actually I couldn't recall. Factoring in that I think he was already sort of on his way out of the door for WCW about a year later, because he ended up doing the whole Dungeon of Doom thing with Kevin Sullivan that was just all kinds of historically bad. But I'd imagine one of the last things he was involved with in the WWF was coming off the pairing with Tugboat when they were doing the Natural Disasters gimmick. Again, that was a little before my time anyway, so I couldn't recall a whole lot of what they were involved with. But, yeah, I don't really remember a whole lot about Earthquake having a long-standing singles push right before they released him. But he assured us that he's back, so we'll see what they wind up doing with him in the short term. I imagine it's something more intriguing than him squashing Corey Student. That's all there kind of was to the segment, though. Really didn't have anything else to add beyond that. He did a lot of big man splashes and slow rope running, which was kind of the only thing John Tenta was really capable of doing. Nothing against the guy, but just being blunt. Give him credit, he was at least a little more agile than Bash and Booger. And the only other thing to really add to this recap is them announcing IRS versus Marty Jannetty for next week's Raw. Jannetty trying his damnedest to do a convincing babyface promo on how the IRS does nothing but kick people while they're down and steal from the least fortunate. And he also assured us that next week, the IRS isn't going to have a hand from the government in helping him win his match. To which I thought, boy, wouldn't that have been a hell of a gimmick. Random sightings from the invisible government coming in to help Mike Rotunda cheat to win his matches. That would have been something else. And totally in the realm of something that would happen WWF circa 1994. Invisible entities and magical powers. What more could you ask for? They were doing it with Undertaker, so why not? Anyway, that should at least be a solid enough match. Razor Ramon was also standing there, so I would presume he would factor into that match somehow, which means that it would technically be 2-on-1 advantage babyfaces. 3, I guess, if you count Sean Waltman. But, yeah, you also got Michaels lurking in the periphery, so maybe he'll factor in somehow. because we still got to set up that ladder match at WrestleMania. But anyway, well, this show's running pretty long anyway, so I think we're going to wrap things up there. Decent enough episode of Retro Raw, but not really anything all that remarkable. So, guess I'll just close with this. Make sure, obviously, to subscribe to the FSWR channel if you have not done so already. You can check us out on Rumble as well if you prefer secondary platforms. Again, you want to throw your thoughts into the 2023 Royal Rumble, by all means feel free. Or if you disagree with me on something and you want to throw your hat into the mix, let's have a conversation. But all in all, I would say not a horrible Royal Rumble event, but not one that I'm going to go out of my way to watch again in the next 5 to 6 years. So, take care all. Thanks for watching, and we'll be back for the Friday podcast with our Dynamite rundown and the continuation of our second portion of the Retro Review series. Peace out.